November 25th, 1847, Beaufort, South Carolina. The air on Christmas Eve was thin and cold, carrying a salt dampness from the river that crept through shutters and door seams. Evening shadows drew long across the plantation yard as the bell of St. Helena's tolled 6 times, its iron throat summoning townsfolk to prayer, yet echoing over fields where no prayer was allowed. Within the house, fires roared in every hearth, their light casting amber ribbons across the polished wood panels of the dining room. Before we move to the story, please let us know from where you are watching this video and what's time now when you are watching this story. Clara moved quietly, shoulders stooped from habit, bearing trays of polished silver toward the long table. She was 19, small-boned but straight-backed when alone, a house girl whose silence filled more rooms than her voice ever had. Her palms itched from lye and frost, but she turned each plate with practiced grace, her motions exact as calligraphy. No sound betrayed her thoughts, though behind her measured steps the echo of bells seemed to mark something far greater than the hour, a tribunal unspoken. Earlier she had passed through the woodshed, summoned by the cook to fetch kindling. There her fingers had brushed against the haft of an axe, leaned against the wall. Someone had polished it in recent weeks, perhaps for splitting logs with festive ease. Its surface felt alive, the grain breathing. Just one touch, fleeting but deliberate, and something within her stilled as though the tool itself bore witness. Unused, unchanged, it waited like a quiet judge in rough wood. These details no one saw. To the family arrayed upstairs, Christmas provided a stage of faith and abundance. Candles dripped wax onto brass saucers, garlands edged each doorway, and white damask cloth flared across the dining board, the fabric starched to stiffness. But within these ornaments, Clara carried different knowledge. Tonight was not feast, but verdict. Long before any courthouse, long before sworn juries, there existed reckoning whispered in the marrow, rising when bells set the hour against silence. She moved from hall to pantry and back again. The hinge of each door responded with a groan or squeak, as though reluctant to yield her passage. She memorized every sound, every resistance of iron against its socket. Each opening and closing was a rehearsal, each knock of air a signal. Far above, the family's laughter rattled the beams. Far below, footsteps of the enslaved slid across cold flagstones, careful not to call attention. As the night deepened, Clara's reflection caught briefly in a darkened window pane. A slim face, eyes luminous from candle glare, lips pressed shut. Her name had seldom been spoken in gentleness, but she carried it within, as if engraved, a cipher of endurance. Tonight she let it resound inwardly, almost a litany, grounding her in ways no psalm could. The smell of roast meat thickened the corridors. Clara passed the ledger desk in the hall, where papers lay fan-spread, contracts, debts, the currency of power. She glanced and then away, knowing such ink-bound claims had carved lives apart, including her own kin. Across the room, the bell sounding 9 announced not comfort, but confirmation. Time marched toward midnight, where vows once dormant would awaken. Surrounded by warmth, yet standing cold in spirit, Clara knew this was not simply Christmas Eve. It was Judgment Night sealed in quiet code, her will pronounced not by gavel or scripture, but by the silent touch of an axe in the woodshed and the hollowness carved by loss. Frost clung along the sills of the field cabins, like lace sewn by an unseen hand, jagged and glassy. Breath of oxen and men alike hung in slow clouds as night pressed down upon the quarters. Doors patched with scrapboards rattled in the wind, hinges complaining with each gust. Within those cabins, families huddled close over embers, trading warmth by touch. Their supper was thin, corn mash, a sliver of smoked fish shared between 3. Hunger settled on them as common as the chill. Across the yard, a different season reigned. The big house glowed with oil lamps, their flames bold and upright, refusing night's encroachment. Candles crowned the dining table, where a cloth white as bleached bone spread beneath silver tureens. Platters steamed with fat duck and sugared yams. Laughter dripped from the hallways. Too easy, too careless, echoing into rafters polished by years of profit. While outside the ground bit bare feet with frost, within marble tiles warm to the tread of boots and slippered heels. The two worlds shared the same December air, yet opposed one another utterly. For the enslaved, the holiday granted a moment's pause from the whip, but little else. Their mouths remained hungry, though songs were forbidden to fade. For the masters, the night-sanctioned display, each ornament proof of dominion not only over acreage, but over lives. Clara carried platters between pantry and hall, the seam between these spheres. Passing the porch, she felt the air cut sharp upon her skin, only to be covered again in the warmth of chandeliers moments later. She moved between ice and fire, silence and exclamation, her very body a vessel shuttling between contrasts. In the yard, children pressed cheeks to window panes, their breath fogging circles on glass. Inside, toasts rose, crystal struck, and bells from town floated faintly across the water. Those iron tongues pealed tidings of joy, but to ears in the cabins they clanged instead a litany of distance, notes marking who belonged in radiance and who in shadow. Clara set the last dish onto cloth so bright it seemed to deny any stain. Yet she knew smudges could not remain hidden forever. The frost, the hunger, the rattle of makeshift doors, all waited beyond those glowing walls. The knight stood on tiptoe, watching how these two winters touched but never mingled. Memory returned sharp as a thorn whenever Clara bent above wash-basins or stood silent at prayer. She had once believed the slender promise given by the master's wife 2 years past, that if Clara bore faithful conduct in the house, her younger sister Ellen would be spared the field auction. Such was the bargain, obedience exchanged for kinship's safety. Clara clutched at it as a child clutches a candle stub in darkness, trusting the flame though it sputtered. But promises given by those in power carried cracks like dry clay. In the summer of '45, Ellen was led to the auction square, her wrist bound with a strip of white cloth so buyers might see which child belonged to which lot. Clara remembered the cloth more vividly than the faces. It fluttered in humid air like the flag of surrender, though no one present felt shame. Bidders called numbers, quick and sharp as if reciting scripture. When the gavel struck, Ellen disappeared southward into oblivion of swamp roads and fever lands. Weeks later, word traveled by whispered channels. Ellen had not survived her first season. The fever claimed her within a year. Clara pressed her ear to the boards of the storeroom that night, not to overhear, but to muffle the cries pouring from her own lungs. No scripture came to console, no master's vow to shield. There existed only the ache carried forward, an ember no water could quench. From that wound Clara formed a covenant unsung yet unbreakable. She made no oath aloud, sound might betray her, but in silence she bound herself. The weight of it pressed against her ribs each morning, a second skeleton shaping posture and step. She resolved that the loss marked not merely an end, but an opening, that one day the scales of power and grief would be leveled, if only by her own hand. She carried Ellen's name as prayer, repeated inwardly, though lips remained still. Whenever her fingers brushed fabric, whether rough flax or starched linens, she felt the ghost of that single scrap tied at auction. The cloth became emblem of rupture, but also banner of intention, unseen by others, yet unfurled within her spirit. That winter night of Christmas Eve, memories lapped at her like the tide along the Beaufort marsh edges. Bells in the far church tolled 7, and each reverberation seemed less a summons than a testimony. hours passing not toward celebration, but toward fulfillment of vow. Every tick of the hall clock aligned with her heartbeat. In the pantry's hush, she unfolded strings of garlic, stacked pewter mugs, swept ashes clear of kindling. Each humble task echoed against her vow. She had learned to mask resolve behind diligence. Obedience provided cover for defiance hidden. Where others read only dutiful girl, she harbored tribunal fire. What broke 2 years ago was not solely a promise, but the illusion of mercy. Clara understood then that bargains offered by the enslavers were written in disappearing ink, meant never to last longer than convenience. What endures is loss transfigured into will. She resolved that when the bells reached their highest peal near midnight, her vow would meet the world not as whisper, but as act. Ellen's absence became her tether and her compass. Clara would not allow silence to erase her sister's name. By keeping it alive within, she ensured that the child, tied by a white scrap and carried off to death, did not vanish entirely. In her heart, names chained became names liberated, each repetition a spark. Thus the wound, marked by cloth and cry, forged the vow secreted in Clara's marrow. Dusk deepened, and in the tool room behind the stables, the air grew sharp with the scent of resin and damp earth. Lantern light flickered across stacked implements, their shadows thrown immense upon the planked walls. Clara slipped in under pretense of gathering wood, yet her gaze settled not on logs, but on one object leaning against the far bench, the axe whose handle gleamed with recent polish, as if prepared for ceremony rather than labor. She drew near with cautious steps, letting fingertips graze its hickory haft. The wood was smooth, unscarred, and seemed to hum with a secret resonance when her nails tapped lightly upon it. She imagined the grain carrying whispers downward, as if memory dwelt in fibers and rings. What had been cut before, what might be severed yet, all possibilities seemed stored in this silent earthen record. Clara closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against the blade's shoulder. She felt a heaviness pass into her bones, as though the axe itself possessed patience to hear what no human would. She released one breath that shaped only in thought, never in speech, a vow repeated. Tools, she realized, were repositories of faith. They bore witness without betraying. Beside the bench sat a small jar, earthenware capped with cloth. Within it rested powder steeped from bitter roots, carried back by an elder from marsh edges. Clara had struck a bargain for it months earlier, trading nights of needlework stitched by hidden candle. Now this vessel joined the axe as listener and accomplice, unseen testimony waiting for the proper hour. From the rafters, wind caused ropes to sway, their fibers creaking like low voices. Clara glanced upward, then touched the axe once more before covering it carefully with burlap. To any observer, she appeared only a servant stacking kindling, but within her chest a rhythm beat steadier than any drum. As she stepped into the yard, the bells in town tolled the half-hour after 9. The resonance came blurred by distance, but distinct enough that she measured it inwardly, like a metronome guiding secret labor. Above, stars sharpened into clarity, diamond-hard against the winter sky. The tool room returned to stillness behind her, yet Clara carried its silence with her. The axe rested, quiet but alert, the jar secreted beneath floorboards to wait. And with every hinge that groaned as she re-entered the house, she heard the refrain. Anew, the world appeared deaf, but wood and iron heard her. Objects had become her congregation, soundless yet faithful. She alone knew the sermon would soon demand its hour. In the candle-lit library, the patriarch hunched over his account books, columns of numbers standing like battalions upon pages. His voice muttered sums under breath, as though debts and bonds were scripture uttered for devotions. Clara observed in passing, and marked that here rested the first throne of power, the ledger binding not souls in heaven, but bodies on earth. The second figure of dominion stood in the family chapel, a room small but ornate, walled with hymnals. The eldest son rehearsed orations at dusk, his tones lofty, his hands poised in gestures learned from preaching manuals. He laced scripture and command so tightly that one could scarcely tell which was worship, which was rule. The stair to the pulpit became a Jacob's ladder of authority. The third sphere lay not in scripture nor cipher, but in locks. The youngest son, lively with arrogance, jingled a key ring at his waist and paraded with wine-cellar pride. Doors yielded to him alone, their hinges bending as though made for his pleasure. He measured manhood by barriers opened or shut at his whim, and every key became his emblem of control. Last was the patriarch's table itself, mahogany broad as a ship's deck, length enough to seat assemblies of priests and creditors alike. Here meals served not only as sustenance, but as theater. The head seat proclaimed judgment, the cloth beneath glared white as snow, and crystal flutes sparkled like trophies. Clara, serving nightly, knew this space as altar of command, where dignity was portioned sparingly and pride devoured wholly. From these 4 places, Clara quietly assembled her inventory. She watched the patriarch hunched over ledgers, the eldest rehearsing scripture on stair, the youngest rattling keys at cellar doors, and the table awaiting its presiding lord. Each chamber became not sanctuary but shrine prepared for inversion, places where her vow might one day breathe reversal. Passing unseen among them, her ears attuned to bells outside, Clara stitched a mental map. Sanctum of numbers, stair of sermon, corridor of locks, board of feast. 4 lessons etched themselves not in ink, but in resolve, each authority fragile, each ritual awaiting disruption. The night grew still, yet she felt the weight of direction settle upon her shoulders. Power revealed itself through symbols. She, in turn, kept symbols close. One girl with silent memory stood before 4 citadels, not in awe, but in preparation. The bells rang 10, setting the tempo. Time unfolded its corridor, and she stepped within. Near the kitchen hearth, the coals burned low, warming pans scrubbed to dull shine. Clara bent over them, hands steady as she poured oil upon a rusting hinge, working the liquid deep until the screech softened to a whisper. Each iron joint throughout the passageways she learned. One groaned like an aged throat, another quivered soft as a sigh. Knowledge of sound became her compass. In the pantry, she tested a lock with grease, sliding key gently to gauge its trust. The mechanism yielded smoother, no cry to betray a midnight passage. Against the wall, she pressed cheek to hear the slow tick of the kitchen clock. The small machine kept cadence with her nerves. Each strike promised one interval closer. In her apron, she carried folded paper scrap on which she had penciled, secretly and at hazard, the names of the lost. She dared not show it, dared not whisper it aloud when others lingered, yet she touched the creased surface with fingertips as if greeting companions. Within that gathered liturgy, she heard them breathe. When footsteps from the dining hall boomed above, Clara tucked the scrap tighter against her skin. She continued polishing flagstones, brushing ash, aligning pewter. To an onlooker, nothing unusual moved here. But beneath every modest action rippled anticipation, an invisible tide surging toward midnight shore. The hour neared 11. Doors settled into stillness, hinges eased by her discretion, the path before her mapped by practice. Quiet preparations hid beneath kitchen smoke and candle gutter. All was set, and the world rested unaware. Clara pressed her back briefly against the pantry wall, listening to the clock's next strike. Within silence, every name whispered through her pulse. The threshold loomed, only time itself remained to be crossed. The household's clamor swelled as the church bell tolled 11 across the river, that deep vibration shaking glass panes in their frames. Upstairs, music stammered from a violin drawn by clumsy hand, and laughter crackled over the firelit parlor like sparks striking iron. Servants moved briskly through halls, bearing wine, folding napkins into fans, tightening the folds of white cloth upon the dining board. Clara slipped into the dim scullery, a refuge behind swinging doors, where scents of yeast and spice clung to air. Here, lantern light wavered, shadowing her against shelves lined with jars and stacked bowls. She set before her the small folded scrap she carried, smoothing it carefully on the table. Names inked in hurried script stared back, each one representing a voice stolen from these rooms. She did not speak them into noise, rather she mouthed them silently, each syllable rolling as prayer. In repeating them she felt the air still, as though the walls leaned to catch their reverence. Her whisperless litany bound the room into congregation. The scullery bricks seemed to echo with cadences, the ceiling beams bearing witness. To recall the names was to refuse erasure, to claim lineage denied by sale and whip. From the pantry Clara retrieved goblets of silver. Into 3 she poured wine dark as midnight. Then she lifted the earthen jar secreted from the tool room, its lid bound with cloth. With hand unwavering, she let a measured thread of dark tincture sink into the liquid. The mixture swirled briefly, then vanished beneath crimson surface, bitter roots hidden by sweetness, silence folded behind festivity. The bells of town tolled 11:15, their vibration seeming to crawl along floorboards beneath her soles. Clara stilled, waiting for the sound to fade, then resumed her work, steady as a scribe. She polished each goblet until its sheen reflected her face in distorted fragments. One vessel showed her eyes too large, another her mouth closed tight, another her brow furrowed. The reflections mocked and affirmed her, each in turn. When she carried the tray forth, no one questioned. They merely saw a servant performing duty, a girl invisible save for motion. Yet within that invisibility swelled decision. She had spoken her names in the scullery. She had measured her drop of bitterness. Judgment walked with her now, quiet as powdered ash settling on coals. The 11th hour neared its end. Doors breathed upon hinges as guests shifted from parlor toward dining board. Clara lingered one step behind, merging with silence itself. Each toll of the bell drew nearer the boundary. When midnight answered, her vow would cease to be thought hidden and instead become act undeniable. The master withdrew from the dining company to his study, claiming business demanded his attention before feast. The library smelled of tallow smoke and ink, air heavy with the musk of stored leather volumes. Ledgers lay open across the wide walnut desk, columns of sums and names aligned as though holy writ. By the fire's glow, the patriarch traced figures with a quill, lips murmuring interest and debt as though sacramental verse. Clara entered softly with tray in hand. The goblet for him stood discreet among papers, red wine flashing against his calculations. She placed it beside blotter and sandshaker, then lowered her eyes in customary obeisance. He gave little notice, too absorbed in arithmetic. The scratching of quill merged with the clock's pendulum into rhythm precise, relentless. He lifted the cup distractedly, pausing only long enough to mutter an instruction about the cloths pressing for tomorrow's service. Clara inclined her head, though, offered no reply. The liquid touched his lips, and he returned to notation, unaware that sweetness masked bitterness coursing within. Around him, the room performed its authority. Tall shelves hummed with contracts compiled across decades. Each ledger spine was a stone of the fortress by which he governed households, cabins, and fields. Numbers clattered along margins like rivulets through which lives drained. For him, paper and ink served as chain and iron. Yet, even as he wrote, something shifted. His quill faltered. A blot spread like sudden eclipse upon a neat column. He pressed hand to desk as though balancing weight. Wine dribbled against parchment, staining calculations into illegibility. Clara stood a pace back, silent witness. She noted how the columns blurred beneath crimson, contracts dissolved as though denied by heaven itself. The sanctum of numbers, once impregnable, gave way to frailty of flesh. He coughed, the sound startling in its human weakness. Still he glanced toward ledgers as if pleading with ink to preserve dominion. But the ledgers offered no reply. Their silence mirrored Clara's own silence, unyielding, final. Moments stretched taut, marked only by the clock pendulum swinging without mercy. Clara felt the room recalibrate. Authority that had filled it dissolved into echo. She withdrew then, quiet as she had arrived. The door's hinge groaned softly as she shut it behind, testimony written not on pages, but in vanishing breath. In the parlor hall she merged again into the current of motion. No alarm yet sounded. Guests remained unaware, laughter still tumbling from chamber into corridor. But within the study, sums dispersed into void, the master's dominion unraveling like parchment before flame. The bells beyond town struck once more, 11:30, and their resonance carried through shuttered glass. Clara felt the pulse of judgment align with their vibration. One lesson of power had been undone. 3 altars yet awaited their hour. In the southern corridor the torches guttered, their flames casting restless shadows upon plaster walls. The youngest son swaggered there, jingling the keys at his hip, savoring the sound as if it were applause. He spun one key through his fingers before selecting another and thrusting it into the iron lock upon a stout oak door. Behind that door quivered breath stifled. Clara, moving softly down the passage with tray held casual, sensed life confined on the other side. She feigned errand until proximate, then paused by the lintel. When the son turned to boast of his prize, she stilled, meeting his eyes with expression unreadable. He laughed at her silence, lifting the ring as trophy. "All rooms their keeper," he crowed, pressing brass to plate. But the door resisted, hinge swelling against socket, groaning as though indignant. Clara stepped closer. The tray in her hand shifted slightly. Her other hand brushed against the jamb. The iron had been coaxed earlier to soften its voice with oil, yet now it moaned aloud, proclamation rather than concealment. From within came muffled sound, a girl's gasp. The son cursed softly, fumbling key into slot. At that moment the latch gave way with violence not intended, hurtling him forward. Clara grasped at the handle, pulling the door wide. Cold lamplight spilled across the threshold, revealing the shivering captive maid within, hair disheveled, eyes wet, garments torn at seam. The son lunged, angered not merely by discovery, but by thwarted possession. Yet the bitter coursing from wine already drained his body, weakness trembling his step. He stumbled against jam, railing curses that slurred. Clara shielded the girl, holding arm across her shoulder. Together they slipped past as he staggered, keys clattering noisily across floor tiles. The white cloth of the maid's torn sleeve shone stark in dimness. Clara drew it close to cover her, a garment refashioned into symbol, not spoil. Behind them the hinges whined again as the door swung shut of its own weight, sealing him within as if mocking his dominion. Clara guided the freed girl swiftly toward kitchen stair, whispering only, "Hide in wood lot. Speak to none." The girl fled, steps swift, while Clara returned with composure to the corridor. No shouts followed, save a groan, muffled by closed door. The bells outside tolled 11:15, marking time's approach to threshold. Clara breathed steady, knowing another seat of power had fallen, this time not by draught alone, but by reversal of locks and hinges long used as his delight. The door, once weapon, had chosen her side. Light pooled along the great stairwell, dozens of candles mounted in sconces throwing glow upward. The eldest son stood on a landing, voice raised in fervor, rehearsing Scripture as he had done each night since he was given pulpit duties at chapel. Guests returning from parlor halted, admiring how his booming tone soared against timbered ceiling. Clara lingered at base of stair with tray pressed to her breast. To her, his oration rang hollow, each syllable braided with vanity rather than grace. She began climbing, silent, step by step. Shadows fled before her as candlelight wavered, her figure cut upward, fluid yet concealed. At midpoint she paused where banister curled. There, propped upright as though mere ornament, rested the polished axe from tool-room placed earlier under her cunning pretext of firewood trimming. To others it was but tool resting, to her it was Scripture incarnate, memory in timber, verdict inscribed without ink. The Son proclaimed from Isaiah, declaring heaven's dominion and man's duty to obey rightful station. His voice boomed across Stairwell, rehearsed melody reaching toward loft above. But as he lifted a goblet beside him to wet his throat, the tincture's bitterness claimed entrance. He faltered mid-sentence, verse truncating into cough. Congregants murmured, thinking perhaps his zeal exceeded lungs' capacity. Clara moved further upward, eyes never releasing him. Her feet silent, her whisper inward. Names, names, the names carried like rosary beads across her heart. His voice cracked again, knees trembling beneath minister's poise. One hand clutched banister. In grasping, he found the axe's haft cool under fingers. Startled, his eyes darted downward toward her. Cough became convulsion. Scripture dissolved into fragmented noise. The stairwell grew hushed, candles stuttering. Clara stood 2 steps below, face calm, her silence louder than his broken chant. He sagged to knees, pressing forehead against banister as though in desperate bow. But no altar received him, only wood that had listened longer than any man's sermon. He crumpled, body folding, against carved steps. Guests rushed belatedly, but found him speechless. His own Scripture had turned to empty air. Clara retreated, sinking once more into duties, leaving scene behind like psalm ended. Bells marked the 45th past 11. 3 altars now undone, ledger, lock, pulpit. All that remained waited at the long table in the hall, the head seat presiding in silence, soon to be pronounced. The dining hall blazed with candle power, chandeliers brilliant as constellations overhead. White cloth stretched taut across long mahogany, carrying platters still steaming though appetite waned. Guests lingered uncertain, noting absence of master and sons but clinging to ritual of feast. Crystal chimed as they refilled glasses to mask unease. Clara stood near fire, tray balanced, gaze fixed upon the head chair. Empty at first, it loomed more throne than seat, carved high back gleaming with polish. Every board creaked as servants moved around, yet no one approached its vacancy. Authority hung as ghost over the spread. Moments later, word arrived through hushed whisper that father remained in study, sons troubled with illness. Still none dared leave before grace. At command of mistress, guests arrayed themselves, murmuring prayer over meat. Clara carried dishes quietly among them, her hands unshaking. At stroke of midnight, bells rang from town, stronger, deeper, echo reaching rafters. Clara placed final dish, then turned deliberately toward the head seat. Slowly, she stepped along cloth's edge, her shadow trailing long across damask whiteness. Reaching the patriarch's place, she grasped back of chair and drew it outward. Its wooden legs screeched over floor, a verdict unrolling. Guests startled, silence cleaved. Instead of master presiding, Clara alone met their gaze. She set tray atop cloth, silver gleam beside crystal, a servant daring occupation. The room inhaled sharply, disbelief stitching faltering voices. She did not speak. Bells outside did all speaking necessary. Their clang announced judgment's arrival. For a suspended moment, the world in that hall inverted. White cloth ceased to signify purity, it became shroud over ceremony. Plates, once symbols of plenty, turned relics of dominion collapsing. Clara's face reflected calm defiance, mouth sealed, eyes steady. From corridor came commotion, reports hushed of sons stricken, study undone, law no longer shield. Panic rippled among guests. Some rose, half stood, others clutched goblets, uncertain of propriety. Clara remained unmoved. One chair overturned with sharp crash, its sound final. The tribunal of feast collapsed into theater of reckoning. The mistress wept quietly at table's far end, her lace handkerchief crumpled like surrender flag. Beside her, the younger children whispered confusion. Still, Clara did not falter. She had borne dishes to this same place countless nights. Tonight, she bore verdict instead. Midnight bells subsided, leaving hall heavy with smoke and fear. Clara released chairs back, allowing it to topple fully. The head of the table lay supine on polished boards, symbol of power fallen from height. No axe swung, no hand lifted beyond service, yet reversal rang absolute. Guests swarmed from hall in disorder, white sleeves and glittering stones flashing as they fled. Clara remained a moment longer, gazing across cloth once sacred. At last she turned away, absence filling seat, forevermore. After the tumult, the house fell into uncanny silence. Wax burned low, dripping onto cloth stiffened like parchment. In the parlor, Clara moved alone, her feet whispering over polished boards where revelers had scattered. The air smelled of extinguished meat and tallow smoke. Celebration curdled into aftermath. On the hearthstone, a chalice waited, half filled with water. Clara lifted the vial from her pocket, emptied what remnant tincture remained into the cup. The two liquids mingled and clouded before settling clear again, as though Concord had been struck. She raised the chalice briefly to her lips, not to drink, but to mark the gesture. A solitary toast, communion not with guests, but with memory itself. Then she knelt and poured the mixture upon stone. It hissed faintly where embers lingered. The liquid seeped into cracks, soft steam rising as offering. She whispered Ellen's name once within, a seed sown into silence. There ended her ritual, no spectacle, merely balance rendered. Shadows lengthened as wind rattled shutters. The clock ticked past midnight. Across the floor, dark patterns of chair legs, wine spills, and abandoned cloth stretched like ledger lines closed at last. Clara stood still, breathing even. What needed doing was done. All else would now belong to the world outside these walls. Morning light revealed frost again, harder now, the ground white with rime. By dawn, constables clattered through the gate, boots crunching gravel loud enough to stir every cabin. Their coats swung heavy, brass buttons shining as verdicts yet written. They marched into the silent house and found Clara waiting near Hearth, hands folded loosely, garments plain. No resistance marked her bearing. She walked between them with step firm yet measured, as if summoned by bell rather than dragged by law. Out into the yard she passed, where enslaved families gazed fearfully from doorways. None spoke, but their eyes followed her with mixture of horror, awe, and sorrow. Bound in rope, she was led to Courthouse Square by mid-morning, the town rising in anxious hum. Merchants abandoned shutters half open, children pressed behind skirts, men craned necks from horseback. By noon, the hall filled with spectators as trial commenced, its formality brisk, stripped of ceremony. Witnesses spoke halting, reciting what they thought they saw, the master retreat to study, son's collapse, servant last observed with tray in hand. Yet no one could testify beyond suspicion, no poison found, no weapon raised, only silence. Her silence remained. When Aya questioned, Clara's eyes cast forward, lips sealed. She neither confessed nor denied. The judge prattled verdict, his language perfumed with law. Yet outside windows the bell tower struck. Its booming cadence intruded over his phrases, drowning dignity with iron tongues. Those gathered whispered that the servant looked unshaken, her gaze calm as river water, her posture unbowed. One woman murmured she seemed draped in invisible white garment, not as prisoner, but as mourner or priestess. Sentence passed nonetheless. Shackles clanged as guards pulled her back. The crowd pressed closer, each face craving certainty where none lay. Some saw villain, others omen, still others saint obscured. In her stillness each projected their own story. Thus trial became mirror, each watcher condemned or pardoned by their own reflection. In the days awaiting verdict's final seal, Clara sat confined in a barred chamber where stone walls wept with winter damp. Sparse light fell through slits hardly wider than a palm. There she leaned against rough wall, body weary, yet spirit clear. Before her mind rose memory of the cloth once tied around Ellen's wrist at auction, white flutter marking bondage. But now imagery shifted. She saw instead long yards where cloth waved free across lines, lifted by breeze not owned nor ordered. The whiteness no longer a badge of property, but a pennant of release rising beyond fences. Doors and hinges had framed her nights of servitude. Now, in dream, she saw them swing wide with no master awaiting behind. Each creak opened to sky, blue and endless. The bell in imagination tolled not in warning but in welcome, announcing a world yet unbuilt. Clara wrapped arms around herself, steadying breath. Whatever sentence dawn brought, her inward vision had already turned loss to liberation. White had been stolen, she reclaimed it vivid, unchained. Thus the imagery that opened her wound transformed into woven banners of tomorrow. Years spilled forward, carrying tides of change across Carolina shores. The war came, and years later its dust settled. Yet among the quarters and cabins, story continued to move like underground river. Clara's name traveled mouth to ear, guarded and reshaped, never written for fear of reprisal, yet alive upon living tongues. In fields, elders whispered to children as dusk drew them to fire pits, of the house girl who once dared judgment on Christmas night, who carried names like gospel. With careful cadence they told not detail, but rhythm, teaching the act as parable. When bells tolled in distance, children clutched memory rather than fear. At riverside baptisms, youth heard fragments, how ledger and lock, scripture and table, all bent beneath a servant's quiet strength. Those who repeated the tale embroidered, but its essence held true. That remembrance of the lost can turn silence into power. The axe became symbol spoken of as ear that once heard a vow. Contracts became byword for bondage, undone in secrecy. Cloths became banners of hope. Bells became signals of deliverance. Doors became metaphors for transit to freedom. Each motif traveled, altered yet cherished, so that the story was less about death than about naming, about how liturgy of the forgotten could become foundation stone. By late light on certain evenings, women hung laundry of purest white between cabins, letting cloth billow vast and sky caught. Each fold, lifted in breeze, resembled pages unwritten. Passers-by recognized the gesture. Memory abiding, not silenced. Clara's name became not singular but plural, woven into community, spoken as seed cast forward. Thus memory walked beyond shackles, not bound by earth or verdict. Through time, names traveled lighter than chains, stronger than locks, rising whenever bells rang across the river marsh. Unwritten, yet indelible, legacy persisted. How one girl's hushed vow stretched across generations, teaching that even in deepest night, voices could move into morning light. If this remembrance has spoken to your spirit, lend strength to our telling by subscribing to this channel, giving your mark of approval, and leaving in the comments what thoughts or questions linger with you, so the circle of witness may grow wider still.